All right, well, welcome everyone to another episode of The Unpredictable Pipeline. Very excited to have with us today Margaret Molloy. She is the Global CMO for Siegel+Gale. And Margaret, thank you very much for joining us today.
Matt, hello. Delighted to be on the show.
So as we discussed, and as for those of you that have seen some of these videos already, we're covering the idea of the unpredictable pipeline. A lot of us are focused on trying to build more predictability in our pipelines, but 2020 had other ideas. So we're featuring CMOs that can share with us some of their stories and strategies and approaches to creating predictability in unpredictable times. And so I think, Margaret, maybe we could start just by having you talk, just ground us in your company, your customers, and then you and your team and how you're organized.
Certainly. So I am the Global Chief Marketing Officer at Siegel+Gale. Now, Siegel+Gale is considered one of the world's top brand strategy, design, and experience firms. We were founded in 1969 on the belief that simple is smart. So that's our ethos. We are part of the Omnicom group, and clients call us essentially, Matt, at a number of inflection points. For example, a new executive arrives, CMO, CEO, and their ambitions for that company and the brand exceed the current situation. Another scenario is in the context of capital markets. Mm-hmm. So a brand is thinking about an IPO, or they're trying to raise capital, which has been a big phenomena in the last quarter, or a merger, acquisition, or divestiture. And in all of those scenarios, standing up a good brand enhances the valuation of the entity. And perhaps a third scenario your listeners will be familiar with is when a brand leader, CMO, CEO, wants to really deeply understand the customer experience, improve it, simplify it.
Mm-hmm. And so talk a little bit about sort of who some of your sort of best customers are, and then how your marketing team is organized to support the business and to support those customers.
So we have a variety of clients, as you would expect from an agency standpoint. We're a global entity. I lead our marketing efforts from New York City. I have colleagues in San Francisco, LA, London, Dubai, Shanghai. So a very global operation. Our clients traverse practically every industry and that geography. So for example, Hewlett-Packard, when they spun out HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, they called on Siegel+Gale to create that brand identity, articulate the purpose and brand experience. Way back in the archives, we designed the NBA logo. I know you're a basketball fan. And in more recent times, we rebranded CVS to CVS Health to position that entity as a healthcare innovation company. So tying back to the drivers, many different drivers, one commonality I would say is the companies that collaborate with Siegel+Gale conspire with our ethos around simplicity. Mm-hmm. And that's why they select us, and that's what they're craving at that point in time. In terms of our marketing organization, we're a lean team. I have a small number of dedicated colleagues on my team, and I'm continually leaning on the expertise, as you would expect from an agency standpoint, of my practice colleagues, our designers, our strategists, our namers, etc., because it's their expertise that the client is buying.
Absolutely. Well, I want to double down a little bit on that idea of simplicity, especially whether it relates to, brand marks or just sort of brand strategy and brand attributes, so to speak. Talk a little bit about why that's so important for brands, and what are some of the pitfalls maybe that companies fall into when they create more complexity than is necessary. So I guess, why does simplicity matter?
Oh, one of my favorite topics, Matt. It might be helpful first to anchor in what we mean by simplicity, because frankly, and perhaps surprisingly, it's often misunderstood. Mm-hmm. And for us, simplicity happens at this gorgeous intersection of clarity and surprise. So there are a variety of dimensions to simplicity: clarity, transparency, utility, beauty, and consistency. And very often when people think of simplicity, they tend to be too reductive and their thought process just goes straight to clarity. But to create a truly simple customer experience, you need to be mindful of all of these dimensions. Now, we say simplicity is smart, and that's an ethos, but it's also something that we've worked to codify empirically. So every other year, we run a study called the World's Simplest Brands. It's a ranking of brands around the world, and you can visit that on our website. But at the strategic level, there are three really important benefits that we've observed over a decade in terms of the validation of that idea that simple is smart. And the first is that customers are willing to pay more for simpler experiences. Two, they're willing to recommend and refer others for brands that scored best in our study, i.e. simpler experiences. And fascinating to me, the stock market performance of the top brands in our index exceeds that of any of the indices, which is to say Wall Street, the capital markets, reward simplicity as well. Now, your question implies this important contrast with complexity. And what we found is that complexity can be a natural output of growth. No company starts out intending to be complex, but companies grow, they add product, they add colleagues, they add markets, and inherent in that is the inevitability of complexity. Another driver of complexity is this notion, and it's very common in B2B and technology companies, jargon. And the notion that you can command a premium, or back in the day, you were a smarter executive if you had all the vocabulary and all the jargon. So those are some of the drivers. And then frankly, the proliferation of channels, the proliferation of every media right now just makes it that bit harder to be consistent, to be clear, to be transparent across every customer touch point. And what I would say to you, Matt, is the genius of simplifiers is that they know what to strip away and what to remain. That's the genius. And then when it is done well, it brings clarity instead of confusion to your customer, which I'm sure all of your listeners aspire to.
Wow. Powerful stuff in the best of times. And I'm curious sort of what your observations and research has shown this year. I know you guys do a regular CMO study yourself around what CMOs are thinking, what they're focusing on, what they're challenged with. What are some of the things you've learned in that research this year around how companies are doing their pivots in their marketing relative to their brand, and anything else that you've learned?
Certainly, I would address your first point first, which is, what are we seeing now in terms of simplicity? Absolutely, in our conversations with CMOs, there is a broad-based recognition that they need to reduce what I would call the cognitive effort of customers, employees, and the community in interacting with their brand. There's a recognition that people right now are trying to make decisions with limited data. They're stressed, they're harried, so simplicity is taking on more importance. And all of the dimensions I mentioned, the clarity in communication, the transparency, consistency, and the beauty, which can manifest itself in providing people some inspiration and joy. So a big moment for simplicity right now. Stepping back further to the study you referenced, we talked to 26 global CMOs, and the study, we call it In Their Words. And in many respects, when I reflect on it now, I think it'll be something of an oral history of how CMOs processed COVID-19. So you identified simplicity as one of the themes, and we talked about that. Another theme is purpose. A number of brand leaders emphasized how purpose is becoming a rallying call to mobilize their teams and to serve as a filter for which activities to prioritize. Another important theme was this idea of pivoting. And perhaps not surprisingly, a characteristic of that was a shift from a lot of in-person events to digital. A pivot to what was appropriate in terms of tonality, a recognition that some heavy sales-oriented content and messaging could be seen as tone deaf. So an important pivot there. So every CMO took stock of their campaigns, their content, and their programming, and essentially put them into three camps. Number one, this is not going to work, doesn't apply, cancel. Number two, how can we modify this to apply in the new context, be it to show up in a digital channel or to go virtual or even just change the content? And then third camp, what new content did we need to create entirely to serve the needs of communicating with our employees and our customers? So those were some of the themes. From a macro perspective, Matt, I would say perhaps what might surprise people is that there was no compare and despair. These CMOs exhibited tremendous optimism going forward, characterized by leaning on purpose, to mobilize team members, to essentially be a cheerleader in their organization and also a chief listener, listening to what the authorities were saying, listening to customers, listening to employees. And I have tremendous admiration for the pivots they're making and frankly, the huge increases in productivity that all CMOs were reporting. They were putting out volumes of content and programming that in the past they would have deemed vastly impossible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such good stuff. And I know anyone who's interested, in hearing more about that CMO study can check it out on your website. I'm sure some of the highlights and download a copy of this. In a more of a micro format, like as you look at what other CMOs have faced in the last 3 or 4 months in 2020 so far, which of those sort of are like looking in a mirror? What are some of the sort of sales and marketing challenges that you've faced so far in 2020? And what are some of the things that you may have pivoted to address those?
So certainly as a marketing team, our organization was very heavily focused on in-person programming, hosting events, attending events, speaking engagements, etc. And of course that in-live person experience was not an option. So that was a consideration. But if I step back a little bit, it might be helpful to share with you my belief system in terms of how I think about this. And the first dimension of that is culture is really important. At Siegel+Gale, we talk about our values as smart, nice, and unstoppable. And our purpose is to help our clients and our colleagues be successful. And those were really important anchors for our organization in general as we pivoted in the COVID-19 era. Second point I would make for me in terms of the marketing organization, it's really important to have a framework, a mental model that your team can rely on to understand how you're making decisions. And for me, it's about balance and balancing 3 vectors. I call it an ACE: empathy, action, and communication. And everything we did, from our content to our programming to all the pivots, internal and external, we subjected it to that filter. How are we doing getting that balance right between empathy, action, and communication? Because to communicate and not act is insufficient. To communicate without empathy is tone deaf. So that's the balance. And the third aspect that I highlight, and it also draws on balance, specifically on pipeline, is this idea of balancing short-term lead generation with long-term brand building. I am a huge advocate of brand building for our agency and for every brand, because I believe the goal of sales and marketing is frankly to grow your share of voice. And here's how I think about the pipeline. In the pipeline, at its most simplistic, there are 2 audiences. There are buyers and influencers. And most of us, at any point in time, there will be only a minority of our buyers who are in market for our solution at that point in time. So therefore, a lot of the marketing activity that we spend our time and energy and resource on is brand building, specifically content programming, community building. And we do that because we believe that by staying close to the community, providing excellent content and thought leadership, when those buyers are in market, they will contact us. So that's a long-term outlook. In terms of the more near-term programming, we pivoted our events to go virtual, and we had two categories of events, essentially. Category one, closer to demand generation, but a lens of being useful. And that was our practice leaders putting out points of view, white papers, virtual events to share issues around relevant topics pertaining to branding, like, for example, mergers and acquisitions, the role of brand in M&A, because we anticipate COVID will usher in a whole new series of mergers and acquisitions. So that was on the functional area. And on the, if you will, I don't love the term, but demand generation side. Then on the long-term demand, brand building side, we completely pivoted our event program. We had a very robust Future of Branding lunch series that we ran around the world in person, and we pivoted that to digital. Since April, we've hosted thousands of marketing leaders and over 50 CMOs as panelists. And we had very honest conversations around meeting them where they are in terms of how they are doing as leaders, how they are building their brands in challenging times. And some of these conversations were highly emotional when we dealt with topics like racial injustice, pride. Others were uplifting when we did an episode on Generation Z and how young people are processing brands. So long story short, like everyone, we pivoted our programs to digital, but we didn't pivot our mindset, which is long-term brand building is critical for continuity of a firm and frankly for growth, because it generates greater share of voice. And when buyers are ready, you're top of mind.
Love it. This has been super valuable, Margaret. I really appreciate you being able to share what you are learning in the market from your clients and from your CMO study, and also sharing a little bit of a sort of how you have, how you're drinking your own champagne, so to speak, in terms of making some of those sort of priorities and pivots internally. Last quick question for you. What have been some of the resources that have been really valuable for you this year? I know you're a sort of a constant learner, someone who's always reading and learning and pulling in information from other places. What are some books, some authors, some peers? What are some resources that you might recommend others check out this year as we can continue to sort of navigate new waters?
So you identified correctly that I love to source inputs from disparate places. And this season, if you will, I have been an avid podcast listener. So in addition to your wonderful podcasts, I've been enjoying anything The Economist puts out. I've also been enjoying Essentialism by Greg McKeown, FOMO Sapiens by Patrick McGuinness, and Disrupt Yourself by Whitney Johnson. Really powerful resources. And in fact, they've inspired us to create a podcast. So we will drop the 10 episodes that I mentioned earlier from our Future of Branding series coming very soon to our podcast platform.
Love it. Well, we'll look for that. And depending on when we publish this, we'll put some of the link into the podcast and then the show notes for this as well. Margaret Molloy, Global CMO, Siegel+Gale, thank you so much for your time, for doing this today, and for all of your insights.
Matt, it's been a pleasure. All the very best.
Awesome. And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with more unpredictable pipeline interviews with leading CMOs.